Welcome to the 25th episode of Patio Ponderings, the podcast. Hitting 25 episodes seems like a great time to reflect on what we've learned, where we're going, and a little bit of insight into what podcasting has taught me individually. In today's episode, we're going to talk about a few timely ag topics. We're going to spend most of our time reflecting on past 25 episodes and what I've learned. And I'm going to answer the 5 standard questions that I ask every one of my podcast guests. To take a quick dive into timely ag topics, I think the biggest one is we have a brand new USDA Secretary in Brooke Rollins. Brooke Rollins is a longtime trusted Trump advisor. She was sworn in a couple weeks ago, and she served as an advisor to President Trump in his first administration. She spent time over the past few years at the America First Policy Institute, which ingrained her in a lot of topics that I know are deeply held by President Trump and his other advisors. The big question I have about her is, can she push through a new farm bill? We're sitting in 2025, relying on the 2018 farm bill that was supposed to expire 2 years ago. Now, why is that important to ag? The environment in ag has changed. The other thing that we're working on with the 2018 farm bill is the SNAP program. I'm sure things have changed in the last 7 years in supporting people that need those benefits. It's unfair to both agriculture and those getting benefits to rely on a 7-year-old legislation. So hopefully she can get that pushed through. One thing that Secretary Rollins has done is pushing for funding bird flu mitigation, or how we can deal with bird flu. We're going to talk about that in another minute. But that is a huge challenge for United States agriculture. And I'm glad to see that she's stepping up, supporting funding to help mitigate the challenges of bird flu. On the commodity markets and input side, today and tomorrow are the last 2 days that corn and soybean meal spring prices for crop insurance are set. Those will set the standard for revenue protection, MPCI, and other policies that a lot of U.S. farmers rely on as risk mitigation for corn and soybean crops. And just this morning, the Ag Outlook Forum released the 2025 acreage projections. I don't know what those are. You'll have to go look at either Karen Braun's tweets, maybe Arlen Suderman, and I'm sure that Joe Vaclavic will talk about that in his podcast tomorrow morning. The importance of that number is that sets the bar for what we think that the 2025 crop for corn and soybeans will be. And once we put in a projected yield at the end of this month, then we will have a number for us to start trading on. Right now, corn is more profitable than soybeans. The question is, if we print a big number for potential corn acres, will that force the soybean market to drive up to try and buy some acres for soybeans? I don't know. That's out of my bailiwick. Listen to other people to get a better answer on that one. Bird flu is probably the biggest ag topic that is affecting people outside of agriculture. I was at Costco yesterday and bought 2 dozen eggs, and it was over $4 a dozen. Granted, those are cage-free. So it's affecting people's breakfast choices. It's affecting a lot of restaurants and how they charge for their breakfast entrees. As bird flu has taken the limelight in media, I can't help but ask myself, at what point do we stop prioritizing export concerns and focus on domestic production stability and the health of the U.S. flock? Supposedly, if we vaccinate the U.S. flock against influenza, our exports get cut off because our customers cannot guarantee that we don't have bird flu because it'll come up positive in tests because the meat has antibodies against bird flu. But what happens if one of the detractors of U.S. ag publishes some unseemly, disturbing pictures of a pile of dead hens? And I'm not talking about a small pile. Because you need to remember that when we talk about euthanizing a flock of laying hens at a complex in Mercer County, Ohio, it's not 40 or 50 hens running around old McDonald's wife's backyard. It's 2 million hens. It's 4 million hens. It is a huge pile of dead birds. If we get the wrong media attention, that might be bad for ag, but it also might be the impetus to vaccinate. I don't know. I think it's a serious question that ag needs to ask, and I hope that the thought leaders and the influential people in poultry and animal health are asking those questions, because we could be in a bad spot. We are in a bad spot. I'm glad to see that Secretary Rollins is pushing through, last I heard, $1 billion to support and help mitigate bird flu and the impacts on both the farmers and the customers. But I think the big elephant in the room is, when are we going to have the mandates that we have to vaccinate for H5N1? And how will we negotiate with our export customers to allow that to happen? The last timely topic is just President Trump and his administration. We've talked about tariffs, we've talked about DOGE, we've talked about other policies that are coming to light. Will we see a return to these aggressive trade tactics? I heard today that some people said, don't pay attention to what he says, but pay attention to the intent of what he does. And I think we have a lot of people that take what he says literally when we need to take it figuratively. But are those tactics going to pay and make fruit for U.S. agriculture? And how are export markets, input pricing going to shift under his leadership? I think those are things that are yet to be seen, because frankly, he's just into his second month of his second presidency. But that's not why you listen today, I bet. I'm betting that you came to listen to hear what I've learned over the last 25 episodes of podcasting. Now, I have to be a little truthful. There weren't 25 interviews. A couple of those interviews were broken up into small episodes, so it's 25 episodes nonetheless. It's a benchmark on Buzzsprout and Spotify. The first thing that I learned about podcasting is it takes a lot of time. Corey Hillebo and I talked about it last week when he and I were talking about what he learned when he was starting a podcast in the Farm for Profit podcast group. A lot of people think it's just hit a record button and boom, you got it made. I had one friend that suggested I just get a little USB mic, hook it up, and start podcasting. The time investment from brainstorming topics to pre-production to preparing those questions to preparing a skit and then post-production in editing takes a lot of time. And scheduling is its own skill. Now, if you've been in sales, you know that you need to make schedules. You need to call ahead, make those sales calls. You try and plan out your route across the state so that you're not backtracking. We're not new to scheduling. But when you add in scheduling the time to prepare for the interview, scheduling the time with the interviewee, and then scheduling the time to edit, it becomes its own job. And I've learned that preparation makes or breaks an episode. It's no secret that I use ChatGPT. And I use ChatGPT to help me prepare for these episodes. The prompts I give to ChatGPT go something like this. I'm going to interview Corey Hillebo, co-host of Farm for Profit and Farm for Fun podcast and a farmer from Polk City, Iowa. I need information that I can use to build a script for his interview. Can you find that information and generate a script for me? Boom. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. ChatGPT makes a script. Well, then I've got to go through and I've got to say, I don't like that script. We need to change this. We need to change that. So the preparation, in some cases, takes as much time as the interview does. But where the magic really happened is editing. When Kim and I decided that I was going to start podcasting, we made the decision that I was going to start with decent equipment. I wasn't going to start with recording on my phone, dealing with bad audio. What does that look like? Well, I have a nice Focusrite audio interface. I have a nice broadcast style headset and microphone that records nicely. I use Riverside for my remote interviews that does a good job of recording the audio for my guests so that I can then download it. And more importantly, I use a program called Reaper. It's a DAW. I forget what the acronym stands for, but I edit the podcast there. And that gives me a lot of effects, different envelopes that I can use to edit and make the podcast sound good. I can normalize the sound so that my guests might be soft in areas and bring that up. I can take out some of the pops and plosives. I've got a de-esser that makes it sound better, takes out some of those S's. I'm able to manipulate some of the volumes in places where maybe the guest wasn't recorded well or the mic wasn't placed very well. So that helps me make a podcast that sounds okay. It's not professional, but it sounds better than just recording on my cell phone. It allows me to make me sound good, to shorten the questions I have so that my audience can concentrate on what my guest is saying and answering my questions. Editing does that. It allows me to balance between authenticity and polishing. And I've got some opinions on editing that I share with every one of my guests so they know where we're going. I hope that my editing maintains the authenticity and the voice of my guests. The last thing that I've learned about podcasting, and this goes back to my network, I was not expecting the enthusiasm from my guests and potential guests. I only have 2 guests that said no. One of those was for security purposes and what they could or could not be allowed to say from their employer. I totally get it. Knowing the employer makes sense. We'll talk to that person once their employment changes, if it does change. I'm struck by the invitation that I gave to a couple that are going to be interviewed next week. When I sent the message saying, hey, I want you two to be my guest, and their response was an enthusiastic yes with several exclamation points behind it. That was the most enthusiastic response, but that's not abnormal. And that goes back to my network, and I have been blown away with the enthusiasm that my network has shown when I've asked them to be a guest. And I think that's because I'm telling stories. I don't have an agenda. I'm trying to tell their story. And I'm trying to be true to what Kim and I decided to do at the beginning, was to find how the agriculture roots of my guest set them up to be the people they are today. And along that journey with each guest, I hope that we can find some unique nuggets that can apply to everybody's life. And that also applies to me. The obscure nuggets that I found is that I was not a great speaker. And I knew that. But doing these podcasts, editing myself, has shown that I have a lot of room to grow. And I hope I'm doing that. What I have learned is I did not take enough lessons from my mother, who was a speech and hearing pathologist. She was the first person to test my hearing and say, man, you lost a lot of hearing in your left ear. But I did not take the lessons from her when I was younger to enunciate, to articulate, and to pronounce better. I did not take the lessons from her that I needed to project when I spoke. Now I am hyper aware of how I sound, and I'm working on how I can improve. And along the way, I'm learning how to communicate better, and I'm finding small adjustments, whether that's breath control, pacing, projection, enunciation, to try and be better. And to do that, I'm using YouTube. I will be 54 this year, and relying on YouTube is something that I never thought I would be doing, but I'm relying on YouTube to take lessons. And one of the people that I'm spending a lot of time with on YouTube is a man from Australia called Vinh Giang. He's of Vietnamese descent that started his career after school as a magician. And now he's spent the last 10 or 12 years as a motivational speaker and a teacher on speech improvement. And he has a lot of really nice little nuggets that kind of fit the kind of storytelling I do. He doesn't get up and say, well, here are the 5 steps to be a better communicator, and you need to follow this, and you follow this. No, he takes a person and brings them on stage and has them practice. Like, hey, John, can you introduce the audience to me? And then John does it. And then Vin, in his unique manner, goes, you know, John, you did good, but now let's try it this way. When you pronounce every single word, do it over the top. Move your lips so much more. And then John does it and introduces Vin in an exaggerated way and does an awesome job. And that's the kind of way I'm trying to storytell. It's take these little nuggets, mold them, and help people express themselves so we can learn from those nuggets. And I've learned through my editing what I have been doing wrong, and that allows me to go and search for little nuggets on YouTube, whether it's from Vin or Rene Rodriguez or other people, to help me better communicate. When you have to edit yourself and you see your words in audio form on the screen, it opens you up. And if you're not ready for it, it can be hard. The first thing I'm trying to do is remove filler words and unnecessary sound. We all do it. Even the most practiced speaker has a moment or two in their presentation when they have a filler word or a filler sound. For me, it's so. I would start sentences, so, tell me. So, that leads me. I'm conscious of it now. I'm trying to not use filler words as much. But they still sneak in, and I can edit that out if I pay attention. The other thing that I'm trying to work on, and Vin has a couple of small YouTube shorts that really help this, is adjusting pace and volume so that you do not run out of breath. You can really tell on the editing software where you run out of breath and where you do not have the pacing that you need. It looks like a day crescendo, going back to the days when we were in music in third grade, and Mrs. Brewick talks about day crescendo and crescendo. So day crescendo is typically at the end of a music piece where the sound goes down. That's great when you want to emphasize the end of a music piece. Or it's also great when you want to emphasize a point when you're speaking. It's not great when you're asking a question of your podcast guest to do a day crescendo. And I think back to some of the lessons from Dr. Neary when I was on the Purdue Livestock Judging Team many years ago, where he was trying to emphasize you have to end as strong as you start. It's a lesson that I kept in the back of my brain. It's a lesson I did not apply. But I could really see it when I look at the volume graph when I'm editing. So here's an example of bad pacing. Hey, Aaron, can you tell me about the time that you were on this farm and you ran out of vaccine and then you had to try and figure out how you were going to get the rest of the farm vaccinated, but you couldn't come back in time? Ran out of breath. What I'm trying to do, with the help of watching Vin's YouTube videos and practicing with my podcast guest, is, hey, Aaron, can you tell me about that time when you were on a farm and ran out of vaccine? What skills did you implement so that you could vaccinate the entire farm? That was a bad example, but I did not run out of breath. That is one of the lessons that I'm learning and trying to implement as I work with my podcast guests. The other thing that I'm notorious for is having dead air when I ask questions. Now, there's times where dead air or silence are great to emphasize a point, to emphasize that the guest needs to answer the question. But I found myself formulating the question as I'm asking the question, and it ends up being in dead space. I'm trying to work on that. Fortunately, I can edit that out and make it sound good on the final product. So the combination of my podcast and my writing, I think, has made me better. I think my writing and being cognizant of the good and the bad leaders in my life has helped me discern where I want to be as a leader. It's definitely helped me discern what I don't want in a leader. And I've actually used those in job interviews where people ask if I have any questions for you. And I've turned that around to the interviewers, particularly ones that will be my supervisor, into what type of leader are you? What type of response would you want in this type of situation? That's been a huge help for me. As an interviewer, I'm learning to listen more. On all the sales training that we've taken over the years, they're insistent. You have to listen to what they say before you take the next step. You have to listen to what they say before you can ask the next question. That's great on paper. But until you sit yourself in this podcaster seat or the interviewer's seat and you actually have to listen to, then formulate the question. It's a skill that we do not work on. And I think I'm doing a better job of it. And the other thing that I've noticed and that I'm working on is listening to cues or topics in an answer that changes the interview. And I think back to the most stark example of that was when I was interviewing Tara Dinas. I had a list of questions and a direction that I wanted to go. It was down the path of how she started her own business, the work that she did with partners, and how that helps farmers' profitability. Pretty simple. It was a nice road. Until she said she was asked how she would feel about being the only woman in an office. Now, this was 2010, 2012. And my ears perked up, and I knew immediately that our interview had just changed. If I was not listening, if I was not open to taking what my interview or my guest was saying, I would not have taken that nugget that turned our interview into something more than simply a rote discussion about what their business was. I think that's a skill that I'm working on. And it's a skill that I get by talking to very different podcast guests. Now think about the people I've interviewed. I interviewed Micah Malcolm, a growing star in the show pig industry, a successful athlete in high school. But he just turned 25. His experience was so much different than the time I spent with Mike Pearson, the most listened to and probably the most impactful podcast guest I've had so far. The discussions I had with him, I had to lead him and take the nuggets that he gave me to win that conversation. Whereas when I was interviewing other people, I had to pull things out of them because they weren't as polished, they weren't as experienced as interviewing. I think that has really honed a skill that will pay off in the future. And in the future, as I make sales calls, I sure hope if I'm in the position of a tech person listening to the conversation, listening to what the customer is saying or the prospect is saying, I hope I can turn those discussions into questions that help us get the right solutions for a customer. After 25 episodes, 25 interviews, I think I've learned a lot about myself, not just who I am, but what I need to do to go where I want to go. And I hope that when we get to episode 100 or episode 125, we can look back and say, remember those lessons that he said that he was trying to learn, or those challenges that he had in episode 25? They're gone. They're not here in episode 100. So stay with me for the journey and hold my feet to the fire. Now I get to the fun part of our interview where I get to answer the questions that I pose to every one of my guests. It's been interesting listening to the guests as they've struggled to answer these. And it's funny because even the people that have listened to the episodes and have been given the 5 questions still struggle. And I think that's because, as Corey Hillebo and Mike Pearson both said, the questions are pretty darn good. They're not good because the answers are so thought-provoking. They're good because the questions make you think. So here we go. What's one lesson in agriculture that you carry with you every day? I have to remember I was not raised on a farm. But the lesson that I've learned from ag is that you need to get up and do what needs to be done every single day. Whether that's chores, whether that's going to work, you have to get up and do what needs to be done. Plain and simple. That doesn't mean you get everything done that you think you need to get done, but you need to get up. If you could have coffee with any historical figure in ag, who would it be and why? I've been surprised that there's been repeated answers to this question. The repeated ones have been Temple Grandin, Norman Borlaug, and John Deere. And when every one of those explained why they chose those people, it made perfect sense. I'm going to go off the reservation just a little bit here. And my answer of historical figures I would want to talk to would be Hobe Jones. If you don't live in Indiana and you didn't raise hogs and you're not my age or older, you don't know who Hobe Jones is. Hobe Jones was a professor in animal science and state swine extension specialist from the late 50s to the late 80s. And the reason I would like to talk with Hobe Jones is because he resided as an extension specialist over what I would call the heyday of swine production in Indiana. He was a swine specialist when we went from raising hogs as kind of a sideline to a full-fledged business on farms. He resided over the change in farrowing and outside lots to farrowing houses. He resided as we went from 1-site production to 3-site production, though in the early stages. Dr. Hobe Jones would be who I would love to talk to and just spend an afternoon reminiscing over what he saw in his 30 years, or almost 40 years, as a swine specialist in Indiana. What is one underappreciated or quirky thing about agriculture podcasting that more people should know? Well, I hit on it before. It takes a lot of time. Just takes a lot of time. What is my favorite ag-related tool, product, or innovation? Well, I think it is modern ag media and podcasting. We get information almost instantaneously in ag, and it should make us better. And I use the example when I talked to, I think it was Corey Hillebo or Mike Pearson, that Chris Hurt, extension livestock specialist at Purdue, would write an article for Indiana Prairie Farming, and then that would get published, and farmers would read it 2 to 3, maybe 4 weeks after he wrote it. And in the 80s and 90s, early 2000s, that didn't change a lot. What he wrote on August 1st probably applied September 15th. That's not the case anymore. We need to get information fast, instantaneously. And sometimes instantaneous isn't fast enough. So I'm going to say that modern ag media and podcasting, the way we get information almost instantaneously is the ag-related tool that I think is most important to us right now. And the last question, what is one small change that could make a big impact in agriculture's future? Oh, this one's easy. We need to be more inclusive. And it's not just the superstars or the bigwigs that make ag. Rob Sharkey had a TikTok video about this last week, and it told his story about how he was looking for first-time farmers. And his wife, who schedules the guests, had a lot of people that we would call kooks, granola eaters, as first-time farmers. And he realized that those people had stories to tell and they had impact in ag and probably were doing a lot of things better than a lot of people that we voiced upon a pedestal as what ag is. So I think we could be more inclusive. Like I said, it's just not the big wigs and it's just not the chosen ones that are the best people in ag. So being more inclusive is my answer. Well, audience, here we are at the end of episode number 25. Thank you for the time that you've invested in listening to my episodes. Thank you for the comments that you've made, both online and in person. And thank you for just listening. So I'm going to turn the tables on you just a little bit. What has been your favorite episode so far? What little nugget have you taken from one of those episodes? Who do you think I should bring on as a guest? What angle should I do differently to get more of those nuggets of information from my guests? And finally, what topics would you like me to dive into a little more deeply? Remembering that we're trying to find those nuggets and those topics that we can apply to our own life. So in the coming week, I'm going to interview a farmer from Central Illinois that shares a lot of the same experiences I do as a first-generation farmer. I'm interviewing a ag media personality that's leading a nonprofit organization to promote a commodity. And the one I'm probably looking forward to most in the next 2 weeks is interviewing a couple from north central Kansas that I met through Ag Twitter and actually got to spend time with when I spent time in Manhattan, Kansas with my daughter. We're going to have some fun episodes here in the next week or so. So thank you everyone for bearing with me the last 3 months as I've recorded 25 episodes. Stay with us as we continue to dive into people's ag roots to see how those ag roots form them today, and try and find those little nuggets that we can apply to our lives.